Hello and welcome to our first webinar of 2022, where today we're talking about your 7-step roadmap to cyber risk reduction. Just a bit of housekeeping first. So this session is being recorded and everyone is currently on mute. You will receive a recording after today's event, and if you do have any questions as we go through, please use the chat function. And we'll be having a Q&A right at the end to answer anything that you would like us to clarify. And today our presenters are Mark Howie, who's our Sales Account Director, some of you may know, and Martin Ingham, our Technical Director. And I'm going to hand straight over to Mark to begin.
Thanks, Gemma. And just looking at that picture, it's a long time since I've worn a suit, actually, given we've been working from home for a couple of years. But yeah, thank you. So yeah, welcome everyone to the latest in our Q&A webinar series, and the first of 2022, first of many that we have planned. So my name's Mark Howie. I'm a Senior Account Director at Lima. At the turn of the year, I had my 9-year anniversary with the business, and I've been in the industry for sort of 23 years, which saying that out loud does make me feel slightly old. But yeah, been around the block long enough to understand kind of the history and background around cyber threat, and how the landscape's changed and evolved so much over the past past sort of 15 20 years or so. So thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate everyone's very busy, and hopefully you've all got a coffee and a sandwich and a little bit of a working lunch. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes in today's webinar talking about how we can help you to develop a roadmap to support cyber risk reduction. And the idea is that we can help you to work out how you can better protect your organisation and ensure continuous strong cyber posture as you go through the 2022 and beyond. So I'm just going to take the next 2 or 3 minutes to put a little bit of context around, for me, kind of why we've developed this solution and launched it, and why we think it's a valuable addition to our security portfolio. And if I take it back sort of, well, in my tenure, within my tenure at Lima, we've always delivered security solutions. We've delivered perimeter firewall, threat protection, network security, and that's been great, but that's all really been centered around platform. And of course, we have to secure our platform and our data and the infrastructure in which our data resides. But I think all of us would accept that the threat landscape has evolved massively, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, and cyber attacks become much more sophisticated. It's not just focused around platform. I think in the last sort of moving back about 4 or 5 years, Lima made a conscious strategic decision as an organisation to branch further into the world of cyber and security outside, I guess, of the traditional elements that I talked about around perimeter firewall and so on. And we started to develop some services that we launched successfully and delivered, positive results for our customers with. So we started with managed detect and response service, which helps customers monitor and alert on cyber threat and attack, detect those, and then ultimately remediate as rapidly as possible to ensure that you're sort of almost stopping either stopping the attack or mitigating the impact that attack might have if the hacker does get in. Next in line, probably about 3 years ago, we launched our endpoint detect and response service, similar to managed detect and respond on the infrastructure, but more focused obviously around endpoint. And I think again, sort of talking about the pandemic in the last couple of years, that's become really prevalent. Obviously, most of the workforce across the UK and beyond have been working from home, and I think moving forward in the future, we're all sort of becoming accustomed to this hybrid working model, and it's really important that you protect your endpoint because it's an easy way in for for cyber attack. I think sort of moving on from that, beginning of 2022, we launched MVAS, our managed vulnerability assessment service, and the idea of that one is to continuously assess the vulnerabilities that across your IT platforms and systems, identify gaps and remediate. So that's an end-to-end service that we offer to customers that continually bolsters your vulnerability position. And the business, I've seen the business make a huge investment in employing a dedicated cyber team, a team of cyber experts to deliver and manage those services for our customers. And as I said, that's all great, and it's all necessary to in the fight against cyber attack, but it's all platform based. And I think, as I said, cyber threat has moved on, and with it, the responsibility of protecting against cyber attacks has moved on also. It's not just the responsibility of IT anymore, it's the responsibility of the broader business, and actually not just the senior leadership team. I would argue that everyone in an organization has a responsibility around cyber resilience. And what we're seeing is that it's not just about platform, it's also about people and process. And actually, if you look at some of the more sophisticated attacks in the last 2 to 3 years, it's often been a lack of education and awareness around cyber threat with the workforce, people, or a lack of policy and procedure that's allowed a gap and a way in for a cyber attack. So I think in line with our insight-led approach to how we engage with customers, we've developed this cyber assessment service to add to our existing catalogue of assessment services. But this one I think is really quite exciting and interesting, a little bit different to what we've done in the past. And it focuses, as I say, predominantly on those 3 pillars: platform, but also people and process. And the key output of this, the sort of key takeaway for customers when engaging with this service, is all about developing a long-term cybersecurity roadmap to ensure that you're fully protected and you're maintaining a long-term strong cyber posture. So I don't want to steal too much of Martin's thunder. I'm going to pass over to him now, and he's going to talk through the service in a bit more detail. I'm here and I'm available for questions at the end of the session. So please feel free to add those to the chat. Thanks very much for your time. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to probably spend the next 15-20 minutes, because we want to finish on time, and we won't keep for more than 30 minutes that we've allotted, and give you an overview really of the service. The intention today isn't to go into any kind of deep dive. Following on from this session, we can follow up with individual customers to go into those deep dives. So that's something that we'll kind of take forward beyond here. But if we just look at what the service is first, so we just move to the next slide, please. Predominantly, it's building, like Mark said, on our experience over the past 10 years in our credibility around platform security and delivering technology-focused security services, which the majority of customers know us for. And more recently, we've built a number of discrete security assessments around things like 365, infrastructure, and those kind of things. This service is building on that reputation knowledge in terms of security around platform, and building that out into people and process. Most of our customers now are pretty mature in terms of the platforms and the technology products that they're using. But as with most things in life, the weakest link typically in the chain of cyber resilience is normally the people involved. Unfortunately, your employees and our employees in our world as well. And so this process is, this assessment service is looking very much at the people and the processes that support those people, and then ultimately the technology that's kind of the backstop to make sure that all of that glue comes together and you as resilient and protected as you can be. Any of you that have kind of worked with us before in assessment services, you'll be relatively familiar with the approach, but it's a very collaborative process. This one probably more than any of our others, and it's an evidence-based collaborative assessment in conjunction with key personnel within your business, typically taking around 3 days of effort from both parties to kind of go through that process. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of the approach. But this assessment is very much aligned to industry standardization around security posture, so helping you on your way to achieving things like Cyber Essentials Plus, and potentially even things like 27001 / 27002 as well. And the output from this assessment gives you a barometer against those standards, and a really clear insight into where your gaps are against those standards, and gives you some focus then to go and work on those areas to be able to achieve those standards. And that's done through the development and provision, and we provide you with this, the roadmap and the remediation plan for dealing with those risks. That's really the key tangible output from the assessment. This is a service that gives you that roadmap. It gives you the information and the insight and the tooling to go and target those areas and that you need to go and work on to increase the resilience around your cyber posture. So if we move to the next slide and look at how this service is going to benefit our customers, and really the reason why we've launched it. Ultimately, it's about giving you insight into your risks and knowing where those risks sit across people, processes, and platform, and developing that roadmap to risk reduction. So looking at across 180 different areas that we're assessing, and building out where those gaps are, or even highlighting obviously where things are in place and things that you're already doing well against those industry standards. But it can also help develop effective corporate risk registers. So as organizations move through this maturity of security and moving away from just looking at making sure that the right technology is in place, having that corporate risk register is something that the senior leadership team within your businesses can have confidence in and have awareness of where those risks lie, and how you're addressing or mitigating those risks as well. So it will help and support you in building those kind of risk registers. And as I've already mentioned, this service delivers a benchmark against those common industry security standards, so Essentials Plus and 27002. It's not designed as an audit for those services, in the sense that you still have to go out and do those audits, but it will familiarize you with that process. It has very close alignment to the processes for those audits, and will give you the insight and the knowledge to have confidence in going and achieving those standards. So if we look at kind of the approach and how we go about delivering this service, so if we just move to the next slide. As we've said already, this is focused primarily around three major areas: people, process, and platform. And each of those areas are split into a number of discrete sub areas that we focus on. So the assessment is delivered through collaborative interviews. So working with a number of key stakeholders within your business. That's not only IT, but it may, if you have these kind of people available, it may be people from an operational aspect, elements of HR, any kind of existing security personnel that you have in place. And it's effectively a face-to-face interview. It can be delivered via Teams, it can be delivered face-to-face, but it's an engaging process. It requires input from both parties, but most importantly as well, it's evidence-based. So we require our customers to provide evidence to support the statements that are being made when we're assessing these areas. And those areas include things like information security, education, behaviour monitoring when we look at the people aspect, and looking at standards that you already have in place. So what policies have you already defined for your employees to follow from a security perspective? That's everything from basic data protection and GDPR policies through to reporting risk and breaches. User education is really, really important, and often we see people that are maturing through this process, something that's becoming more and more prevalent. So making sure that you have those education programs in place for your employees. Most customers are starting to do that when they onboard and bring people into their organisation, but making sure that that's a continuous process. Obviously, things change and evolve in this area, so making sure that staff are aware of what they should be looking for and how they should deal with certain situations should they arrive, and making sure that you've got those control and behaviour monitoring tools in place, or whether you have anything in that area. So looking for abnormal patterns in behaviour, whether that's external people, whether that's employees and staff, but Also having robust understanding of what to do in the event of detecting those kind of things. And that leads us into the process aspect. So making sure that the IT operating systems you have in place are fit for purpose, that you're adhering to them, that you can evidence that those procedures are effective, and there's no gaps in place there, or where there are gaps, how we can address those, and with other mechanisms. Looking at your business continuity plan. So BCP isn't just about what IT do. It's about looking at how that integrates with the wider business. So making sure firstly that IT have understanding and have a documented IT recovery plan, a disaster recovery plan, but also that that's fully integrated in the wider business, because there's typically a need to have HR involvement, that how you communicate that to staff, what happens in the event of a disaster, how is that managed across the business. It's not just about where the servers and desktops and the technology aspect is available, but also all of the other business critical elements, people and other infrastructure to support the business. Making sure that you've got those threat detection and assurance mechanisms in place. So these are typically preventative technologies with an element of process that has an element of assurance alongside. So making sure that those tools are doing what they say they're doing, how you check that those technology solutions are effective and working, and mitigating any risk and reducing the attack landscape, and that those things are in place. Asset control, so making sure that you have effective asset registers in place, because it's very common for assets to kind of fall under the radar or have legacy systems still in use. And as things age, as most of you will be aware, things age, things become more difficult to support. There can be challenges around vendor support, and that then introduces risk around addressing vulnerabilities within those assets. And it's also important for maintaining a good grip on data leakage, control those assets, make sure they come back into the business, particularly for heavily mobile workforces that are working all over the place, which has become much more common in recent times. And then finally, platforming. Most of you will be familiar with our capability around platform. It's what we've been known for really 25 years, but continuing to build and integrate that element of the assessment into this service. So looking at very much the technology in use, whether that's end user computing, the infrastructure, whether that's cloud or on-premise, and all of those security mechanisms, whether that's perimeter security, endpoint detection, cloud-based security mechanisms, and integrating all three areas into an overarching assessment approach. I've talked a little bit about kind of the actual practicalities of the assessment, but it typically takes around about 30 days to go from the interview stage to having that draft roadmap delivered. And there's five steps that we go through to get to that roadmap. So it starts with that interview process, which I've already talked about a little bit, really around 3-4 days, depending on the complexity of the environment, but that's the level of effort needed in terms of Lima, and also on your side from a customer's perspective, and looking at different people in those areas that I previously mentioned to take part in that interview process. It's really important, particularly for new customers. People that are already working with us will have some of this information already, but understanding the context of your business, particularly from a security point of view, because not everybody needs platinum security mitigation. And so as you move through that sophistication, cost becomes a consideration. It's about balancing cost against risk. So understanding at the outset what your appetite is for mitigating security threats. There's also some common threats that everybody wants to be safeguarded against, but it's around understanding that level of sophistication, and also some of the standards that maybe you're trying to achieve as well, some of those industry standards around security and governance. As I mentioned, it's an interactive audit-based assessment that requires evidencing. So of those 180 points that we look at, we will be seeking evidence that those things are actually in place. So this isn't just about you telling us that you're doing something. We want to see evidence that you are doing that, because that will provide some context in terms of how effective those those areas are and any gaps that need to be addressed. And looking at particularly those, particularly the control analysis elements, so looking at the controls that you have in place, particularly around process and people, and that those controls are being managed effectively. And there's quite a lot of scrutiny around the evidence of those controls. So that's everything from looking at how you're managing your starters leavers process, how you're evidencing that you've deactivated accounts or created accounts based on certain standards, how you're managing some of the technology aspects on making sure that those systems and tools are continually maintained, and that you are evolving those controls as well, and that you're adapting those controls over time, that they're not static. It's all well and good having these things in place 2 or 3 years ago, but as security threats change and the kind of attack vectors drift into new ways of exploiting things, it's important that those controls adapt and are reflective of what's going on. And that ultimately results in a report, which I'm going to show you on the next slide shortly, but giving you a list of what those high and medium risks are, and therefore how you can deal with those risks through a risk treatment proposal, ultimately leading to that draft roadmap. So if we look at the next slide, it will talk through an example report. So this has been translated into context for the webinar today, so it doesn't necessarily look like this in terms of the final output, but it gives you a flavour of what kind of output you get from us through this assessment process. So an executive summary that provides you with a high-level overview of the findings of the assessment, and that's looking at the risk profile, how you sit against those industry benchmarks, and in a little bit more granular detail against the framework, the kind of 7 or 8 areas that we're assessing across those 180 kind of questions. So that risk profile is very familiar to anybody who's ever done any kind of gap analysis work with Lima before. That severe, high and acceptable risk, and the kind of various colour coding associated with those risks, and where you should really start to prioritise treating some of those risks. How you compare against the benchmark, so the 3 key ones being Essentials, Essentials Plus, and 27002. And the reason we use 27002 rather than 27001 is that 2 is more focused on the people and process piece. 27001 is has some reliance on technology. 27002 is much more interested in people and process, and that those controls are robust and in place. So that's why we include that rather than 27001. But if you are achieving a good benchmark against the 27002 framework, it's highly likely you're going to achieve 27001. And then a little bit of breakdown against the control framework. And we also provide you with, and this is where the insight piece comes in, the linking of the chain. So it's quite difficult sometimes, and this is certainly feedback that we get from our customers, that you'll identify a risk in a certain area, and then you'll see risks associated in other areas as well. But how do you join those risks up to understand what the likely scenario is for that a kind of attack or a kind of breach? So we look at all of the information gathered and compile what we see as highly probable scenarios that may occur within your environment. So this will be looking at maybe things that you're doing around backup when combined with perimeter security and starters leavers processes that could potentially result in data breaches. And there's an example there on the slide in front of you, but being able to bring all of that information together to give you examples of what this means in reality, rather than just a particular technology or process issue, building that bigger picture so that you can start to put some context around these issues. And then if we just move to the next slide, we've got a couple of example risks that we've kind of put in place just to show you the typical things that we're calling out. This is by no means comprehensive, but it gives you a flavour of what we identify, how that impacts the business, and what potentially the mitigating step would be for those risks. Some of those could be technical steps, some of it could be investment, some of it could be about education, it could be about introducing or refining policy and controls. So there's a whole mix, and typically this is this is the biggest part of the output report, and something that we spend a good amount of time making sure that you fully understand the findings, giving you the option to ask questions around anything that comes out of the report. And so just finally on the final slide from me, just a couple of points around where we've done this before. So whilst it's a relatively new service, we've had quite an active uptake in terms of customers wanting to embark on this process with us. And what I would say about this service is it's quite diverse in terms of who's taking this up and wanting to get the output from these reports. I mean, the examples on the slide in front of you covering everything from finance to local government to insurance and legal. What I would say is that this service is particularly relevant for people that are either highly regulated, so have quite strict compliance requirements, or are looking to achieve those compliance requirements, so those frameworks that I talked about previously, or have a low appetite to risk, so wanting to really drive down the risk profile within the business around security and making sure that everything's in place to mitigate that risk, or are going through a program of maturity in terms of security. So you've got some of those technologies in place already, but are looking to fill the gaps in and are really trying to ramp up your maturity around your security footprint. So just a couple of examples of where this assessment output has kind of benefited these customers. So if we look at the FCA regulated one, for example, it led to the development of new security policies, so rewriting those information security policies, putting those policies in place and making sure that those employees and their staff are following those policies. There's some technology in there, so make sure that some of those systems are fit for purpose, and that's relevant to all four examples on this slide here. But it also led to, in some of the examples here, it led to some changes around the structure of some of the teams in place, so bringing in different skills or outsourcing elements of this to third parties, whether that's Lima or other partners that we work with, and accelerating other piece of work, so driving out some of those legacy systems, accelerating adoption of cloud services where it can be a little bit easier sometimes to adopt and integrate security technologies into those kind of platforms, and introduce things like education programs as well for employees to make sure that they're continually informed and advised on what those threats look like, how they should address those, and what actions they should take if they come across those threats. So that's it from me. Kind of, I know it's kind of only 20 minutes. There's a lot to take in, I think, in that 20-minute period. Like I said, there is opportunity post this webinar to get in touch with your team at Lima, have follow-up sessions, have a further deep dive on this, particularly around some of the reporting and sharing some more detail around the reporting and how we can help you improve your security risk profile. So I'll hand back to Gemma to open the Q&A briefly. I'm conscious of time, so we probably don't have many time for questions, but back to you, Gemma, for the Q&A.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Mark. That was really good. They're really interesting. So yeah, we've had 3 questions in. So the first one is, what is the most common issue you've found when carrying out these assessments?
I'll pick one up, Gemma. So I think generally speaking, the assessment process is quite straightforward. It's not, it doesn't require much tooling. We're not deploying anything to deliver this assessment. It's about human interaction predominantly, and so there's not many challenges in that respect. I would say the biggest challenge for the customer is the evidence, and being able to evidence that you say what you do, what you are doing, you are actually doing in practice. So I would say the evidence is often quite challenging, whether that's already having something in place that you can call on, or sometimes just being able to find it. But generally speaking, the assessment process is relatively straightforward, and it's probably the simplest one in terms of issues compared to maybe some of our other things where you're used to needing to deploy tools and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Martin. And kind of linking with a similar theme there, how much resource do you need, and who will you generally interview?
So yeah, I touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but generally speaking, the process is 30 days from start to finish. The level of effort required is normally around 3 to 4 days. That's time spent with Lima's consultants going through that assessment. And that will be a mixture of, well, it will always require IT and the IT teams that you've got, but the more diverse people you can provide, the better the output. So where we can maybe get access to people that are involved in the operational side of the business, that maybe look after some of the existing security and governance procedures, and potentially HR as well. So it's up to the customer really in terms of what kind of resource they want to provide. But the broader access we get, the better the quality of the report at the end.
Yeah, okay, makes sense, thank you. And quickly, the very last question was, I'm already doing annual pen testing and vulnerability scanning. Why do I need this service?
So vulnerability and penetration testing is predominantly focused on the platform element. So we talked about the 3 pillars, the people, process, and platform. Vulnerability and pen testing is primarily looking at the vulnerabilities within the platform, where you've got gaps, where you need to do something around that space. So it doesn't replace that process. You would still need to kind of undertake those procedures. But what penetration test and vulnerability scanning doesn't do is have any context or awareness of the policies and the process and the people aspect that's in place. So this is about all 3. There is potentially a little bit of overlap in the platform piece if you've got that pen testing and vulnerability scanning. But if you've got that evidence, it aids in that part of the assessment. But the reason for this service is because of that people and process piece predominantly. Pen testing and vulnerability scanning doesn't touch on people and process.
Yeah, great. Fabulous. Well, that wraps up all the questions. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Mark. And thank you to everyone who's attended the session today. I hope you found it useful and informative. We will be sending over a link to the recording for you later today, and we'll also be sending you a short survey, and we'll be really grateful for your feedback. Thanks again, everyone, and have a really great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.